So the Audi TT is a phenomenal car. It was released way back in 1998. Styling initially was controversial. People loved it or people hated it. Some of the critics said it just looked like a squashed Volkswagen Beetle, but others saw that it was really heralding the early motoring days of those classic sports cars. We had a resurgence in the lovely curves that you got on those early models, which was certainly different to a lot of the boxier shapes that manufacturers were employing. So the TT certainly stood out there, and it's much appreciated now. That design has grown on people. The Audi group have evolved that design. They've created something that has become rather iconic, and it's certainly going to be an appreciating classic. They've really looked at the available platforms and components that they've got, and they've ensured that the TT retains the most sporty options, is really set up for driver enjoyment. That's really where the focus is on the Audi TT. And I think this is why so many people are interested in modifying and upgrading them. So in this video, we're just going to look at some of the best mods and upgrades for your Audi TT, and just look at the areas you should focus on for the best value upgrade. And also we're going to talk about some of the mods that don't necessarily make as much power as people make out they do, or the manufacturers of these parts claim that they do. I really hate to see people wasting money. I've wasted a lot of money over the years on parts. They haven't achieved what the manufacturer's claims were, and I've been left very disappointed and out of pocket. So I want to pass on those tips to you so you can avoid that in your project. It's a sporty car. It still has 4 seats and quite a bit of space in the rear trunk, or the boot. So depending on where you live, you've got different names for it. So we call it a boot over here, but I know that winds a lot of people up. So I refer to it as a trunk as well. So the back bit of the car where you put all your junk, there's quite a bit of space. The battery has been relocated to that because obviously the engine bay itself is quite cramped with the large engines that they've put in. So just to capture a little bit more space in the front of the car, the battery has been relocated to the back. But it's a very, very practical sports car for people. It's very, very reliable as well if you look after it. If you neglect them, there's all sorts of problems. So I've done very specific engine guides on all of the different engines that they've fitted to the Audi over the years. So it started out with the 1.8T, the 20 valve, which was a phenomenal engine, really, really strong and capable of substantial power gains on stock internals. So look at the videos that I've done on those if you want a little bit more detail on those. We've got a 2-litre TDI engine as well. So that produced enormous amounts of torque. It was probably a brave decision putting a diesel engine in a sports car, but it certainly had sufficient performance and low-end torque to warrant that decision that Audi have made. And it's really one of those really nice models out there if you want something that's cheap to run. So again, I've done a video on the 2-litre TDIs, the various generations of that engine over the years, just to help you to see the problems that you need to look out for and the best mods and upgrades for those engines. There was also a 3.2-litre V6, which was quite a phenomenal engine, naturally aspirated. So generally, there's not as much you can do to those engines. I've done videos on the 3.2 V6 as well, just to help you to see where your money is best invested when it comes to upgrading those. But this is going to be a very general guide to all the engines, all the models of Audi TT. The 1.8T had power ranging from about 180 to 225 horsepower. The 3.2 V6 were putting down about 250 horsepower, so power figures did vary from region to region, and a few different models did have different levels that were set, primarily down to the tuning that they used on those engines. There's been about 3 generations now over the years. The first generation was from 98 to 2006. There was a minor refresh done in 2003, which saw a few improvements to the original design. So obviously bear in mind it was a new design. There were a few things that Audi wanted to address. And a lot of that just reflected minor revisions to the styling and the way the car looks. The second generation obviously started 2006, 2007 and ran to 2014. And then from 2014, there was a facelift. They got the lovely new engines fitted to those. So a lot of people really are hankering for some of the older models just for the nostalgia trip. But the new models are real performance cars out there that you won't spend a fortune maintaining and running as your daily driver. So it's a good compromise. If you can only afford one car and you want a fun car, go for the Audi TT. So there's obviously the TT, the TTS model, there's the TTRS model as well, so depending on how sporty you want to get. And often the components from those sporty models can be translated to the less sporty models. So you've got a fairly easy upgrade path. For example, the RS brakes on the standard TT will give you that superior braking ability, and the brakes will fade a lot less than those stock ones will. You obviously need to make sure the PCD and the offset and the alloy wheel size that you've got fitted will accommodate those larger brakes happily without causing any other issues or problems. It was available as a coupe and a roadster, which was the case as well for the second generation. This second generation had an updated design, a more aggressive front end. It certainly evolved that early look and created a new design language for the Audi TT, but retained many of those original details and components that made it the Audi TT.
The third generation, the lines became much more angular and much sharper, and I just wonder what the fourth generation is going to look like.
The 2-litre TFSI engine put out around 200 horsepower. There were more powerful variants available over the years of that engine as well. And the 3.2 V6 was now putting out about 250 horsepower. So they've fettled the engine and extracted that little bit more power from the engine as well. You also had magnetic ride, which was a really clever suspension system. Through the fluid inside the suspension, they could make it much firmer or they could make it much softer. So little iron tend to line up or not line up and move around much more freely, depending on whether there was a current there or not. And it was a very, very responsive system. So the magnetic ride is probably one of the best factory suspension systems a manufacturer has ever provided. But often these systems start to wear out over time. So people look to upgrade the suspension system, and it's hard to beat that original magnetic ride suspension, but it's very expensive to replace. So a lot of people will go with more conventional coilovers and adjust the ride height manually and just choose a spring rate and a dampening rate for the suspension to suit their own driving style. You obviously need to make adjustments to allow for the ECU that was expecting the magnetic ride. So generally there's a little plug-in module that pretends to be the magnetic ride suspension to keep the ECU itself happy. And it was a second generation where you started to see those 2-litre TDI diesel engines being offered. So this was around about the time they went from the PD, the Pumperducer version of the engine, to the common rail diesel system. So these engines provided oodles of torque, lots of power. A lot of people have been annoyed by the use of the DPF filter on those higher powered versions of this engine, but it was certainly necessary to have that to meet those emissions regulations. I've done lots of other videos on living with DPFs and whether you should delete the DPF or whether there's alternatives out there. So the third generation came out in 2014, so it was greatly restyled. The second generation was more of a sort of minor refresh of the styling. They made substantial changes, but not as substantial as they made in 2014. So they've really taken the Audi design language and applied that to the Audi TT. But again, they've retained the styling and the setup of that original Audi, but made it much more stylish, much more modern, and it appeals to a wider audience now. They've addressed the rear spoiler as well, which is often the thing that people criticize in the original styling. So alloy wheels on the Audi TT are probably one of the most popular upgrades. People go from 17 inches right up to about 20 inches. Now, the 20 inches and the 19 inches look really, really nice, I have to admit that, but they do often hamper the ride quality. So generally the newer cars are more suited to those larger alloy rim sizes, but the grip that you get in wet conditions on bumpy road surfaces is often inferior on those larger rim sizes, plus the cost of tyres is much more expensive. So it's often a false economy to increase the rim size. Look instead at the weight of the alloy rim itself, because that has a bearing on how the car handles. The unsprung weight that you're adding by fitting larger rims can really adversely affect the handling of the car. One of the best things that you should do that's often overlooked is just getting a decent set of tyres for it. The tyres are your main contact patch with the road. So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to tyre upgrade? Those 4 points of contact with the road surface are the only way you're going to transmit the power to the road surface. The cornering grip is going to be provided to you as you steer the car, and also the braking power is going to work and you're going to be able to stop the car. So if your tyres are ineffective or just not able to provide enough grip, you are going to suffer on performance. I recently swapped the tyres on my car and it made a night and day difference in terms of getting the traction down. Even in the dry conditions, when the old tyres were reasonably okay, I was getting traction issues when I put my foot down and I explored the upper part of the RPM range. So now with these new tyres, I'm not experiencing that at all. Never underestimate the importance of getting a good set of tyres for your car. The tyres that I fitted to my car were the Uniroyal Rain Sports, and there's a review going up very, very shortly on that. So if it's not up already, be sure to check that video out. But I found those fantastic. They didn't just improve the wet weather grip, they improved the cornering. The car felt differently. It felt like I'd renewed the brakes and the suspension and all the other components, and I didn't have any traction issues whatsoever. So be sure to check out the comments. If you've got a recommendation to make about tyres for this great car, drop it in the comments section so we can share our expertise. You may well have found something that I've not. I don't have the resources to test every tyre out there, so I really do appreciate this feedback. So let us know how you get on with tyre selections and what wheels and tyres you've got on your car. So let's talk about suspension upgrades on the Audi TT. There's lots of different options out there. We've spoken about the magnetic ride setup being one of the best setups out there. So if you can afford to replace the magnetic ride setup with a magnetic ride setup, I would certainly do that. But when you start looking at the cost and what's involved in that, I can see why most people go for a decent set of aftermarket suspension kits. So which brands of suspension kit work best on the Audi TT? Well, there's lots of different brands and makes out there. So I'm just going to recommend the ones that crop up the most and I've heard the most favourable things. Please let me know in the comments if you feel I've missed any or I've been unfair to any of the brands out there, and let me know your experiences on what suspension upgrades you recommend for your Audi TT. Also mention what year and what model of Audi TT you've got, because that has a bearing really on the choices of suspension kits. So we've got AP, Bilstein, H&R, Connie, Spax, ST, and the Waytech, the KW variants are all very, very good suspension systems that people rave about on the Audi TT. You've got to weigh up the quality and the price. So often the cheaper brands have less adjustments. So if you're happy with a more generic suspension setup, it's obviously worth taking that budget option. If you want to take your car out on the track day and really get the maximum performance, you maybe want a little more control over different aspects of the suspension. So that generally is what you get, what you pay for when you go for those more expensive kits. You get more adjustability over the suspension settings. So coilovers are really the route to go on the Audi TT. Most people prefer the coilovers, and the fact that they're fairly easily adjustable on the car. You haven't got to take everything apart in order to make the adjustment. So you can adjust the ride height at the very least and just set up the ride height to suit your driving style. So if you've got a lot of potholes in your area, a lot of bad roads, you might want a slightly higher ride height. But also you can, on some of these, adjust the spring rate, the firmness of the suspension itself. So you may prefer a slightly softer suspension. I note that a lot of manufacturers in their sporty variants, they've not gone for very hard, very low suspension. They've often lowered it slightly, but they've softened up the suspension just to improve the road handling. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to setting up the suspension. You want the wheels to be in contact with the road surface. The suspension itself is designed as the car corners and rolls to adjust the geometry, the angle that the tyres are at, to maximise the amount of cornering grip you have. So even if you don't change the suspension, making sure that the angles on the suspension are set up correctly can make massive differences to the way that the car corners. So the camber angle of the actual wheels, the toe angle, whether they point in or they point out, can have a bearing on its ability to corner, but often improving the cornering affects the straight line stability. So there's often compromises. Some models, it's much more of a challenge to make those adjustments. You might need to get an aftermarket kit to adjust the camber, for example, or to go significantly beyond what the manufacturer has set. But getting your suspension set up by a specialist that knows what they're doing can make a big difference to the way that the car handles. The 3.2 V6 was a phenomenal power plant in its naturally aspirated form. There's not a lot of scope for extracting substantial amounts of more power from it, but certainly with the remap you can increase the torque curve and increase the mid-range power response and generally make it much more fun to drive. So there's certainly a lot of things you can do to that, but any turbocharged engine in the Audi TT, it's really remapping that you need to look at, tuning the ECU to get the maximum amount of power, and that usually is the most effective mod that you can do. So what is ECU tuning or remapping the ECU? What are the benefits that you get from doing that mod on your Audi TT? So I've done quite a few videos on remapping or tuning the ECU. The ECU is the computer inside the engine. It's controlling everything to do with the way the engine burns the fuel. So diesel engines and gasoline engines have very, very different setups. They work completely differently. Check out the video on the differences between the two if you're not sure. But the ECU itself is controlling generally the fuel delivery, the timing of the air. If it's got a turbocharger, it may well be controlling the boost on the turbo. And the ECU is just monitoring everything going on inside the engine. And generally, if it notices something awry, too much air, too little fuel, it will make an adjustment and just make sure that things are running smoothly. So inside the ECU, you've effectively got a little map that tells the engine what it should be doing at any specific RPM. It tells you what the air to fuel mixture needs to be, where the spark needs to be if your engine has a spark ignition system. There's so many complexities that go on inside the ECU. But with a turbocharged engine, the scope is phenomenal for just increasing the power by changing the tune inside the computer. So for most turbocharged petrol, gasoline or diesel powered cars, you're looking at about 30% more power. Now that's effectively a free mod, a free upgrade. Manufacturers have dialed back the power to meet emissions regulations, conform to the local requirements of the maybe poor quality fuels. The owners are not going to maintain their cars that well. So they have to build in a big safety margin to cope with bad maintenance, dirty plugs, a clogged air filter, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of scope there for just improving what the manufacturer has done. So will that necessarily increase the emissions? Well, it doesn't always. You can make the engine more efficient. You can work to tighter sets of parameters, reducing the fuel consumption and also getting more power from the fuel that you're using. So the theory is that you use less RPMs to get a higher power figure. So if you drive accordingly, on a lot of situations, particularly on diesel engines, you will see better fuel economy after the engine has been tuned or mapped. Gasoline engines are slightly different. You don't always see better fuel economy on those, and most people will tune an engine to get the maximum performance. But check out the other videos I've done on ECU tuning, the pros and cons, the things to look out for, and the sort of things you should take into account when you start looking at this mod. Now, that mod itself helps all the other mods that you've done to work more effectively. So you can just tune the ECU on its own, changing the map, and you will see significantly more power. But if you've changed the air intake, the exhaust, altered the turbo, made other adjustments to maybe the fuel delivery in the engine, you need that ECU to be reprogrammed to take all of that into account. So the next most significant mod that you can do is changing the turbocharger. So turbocharger upgrades are obviously going to add a lot of power. The turbo is that thing that is compressing the air, allowing more oxygen-laden air to get into the engine. Adding a different turbo can dramatically alter the profile of the power that is produced from the engine. So generally speaking, larger turbos provide much more power at the top end, but they take a while to get going. The turbines in them are somewhat larger. They need a greater velocity of air to get going, so you experience more lag low down. Now, manufacturers have done clever things with twin scroll turbo designs where the exhaust channels are separated, and that maximizes the velocity, and a lot of these turbos will spool up just as quickly as the smaller factory counterparts. Also, we've got variable vane technology into turbos that alter the angle of the air as it goes into the turbo, which again can aid the velocity and help the turbo to spool up more quickly. So there's also some other considerations. If your car engine has variable valve timing on the exhaust and the intake, you generally see better gains than if it's only got variable valve timing on the intake side, because that affects the velocity going into the turbo. So I've heard from people with some engines that have swapped the turbo to a larger one, they haven't got the variable valve technology on the exhaust side, and it's made the turbo very, very sluggish. It spools up very, very slowly, although they are benefiting from higher power figures at the top end of the RPM range. So going outside of the manufacturer's lineup, you can go for a hybrid turbo, which essentially takes the case of a factory turbo. So it's a swap-in replacement, and they've completely changed the internals. They may even have machined out the inside of the turbo to allow the larger compressor wheels to go in. But there's a lot of potential power on offer for turbo upgrades. It is a bit of a minefield. There's so much to choose from. Generally speaking, I'd recommend that you get a kit, get something that bolts straight onto your engine. You don't want to be doing extensive plumbing and extensive rework, but whenever you change a turbo, whichever of these options you go for, you should get an adjustment inside the computer. It's now having a big change in the availability of air at different points in the RPM range. So speak to your tuner, tell him which turbo you're getting, get his feedback, hopefully it's something he's familiar with and he can give you a bit more advice as to whether it's suitable for your engine. And I've done lots of other engine specific guides where we actually discuss turbo upgrades, and I've based that on feedback that I've got from my members, feedback from viewers on this channel, and just general research that I've done when looking into upgrading these engines. So if you've got any other tips to pass on, please let me know in the comments. I'm grateful for all of the feedback that we get. We're all here to learn. So when you've upgraded the turbo, it's now time to think about the fueling. So we've gone over to direct injection on gasoline or petrol powered cars as well as diesel powered cars. The fuel systems provide a lot more fuel than they used to. They're running at much higher pressures, which actually means in most cases we have a lot more headroom to play with. So what sort of things should we bear in mind when it comes to fueling upgrade? The whole point of tuning your engine is to get it to burn more fuel. So increasing the injector capacity, so more fuel is going into the engine, is an obvious route to getting more fuel in the engine. But that needs to be supported by the high pressure fuel pump system, the thing that's pressurizing the fuel rail. So in most engines now you have a fuel rail where the pressurized fuel sits and the injectors effectively open. The injectors themselves set a spray pattern so the fuel atomizes as it goes into the engine. Some of the modern injectors have much more controllable settings, so you can alter the rates at which they open and really shape the rate of fuel that's going into the engine, and that has advantages when it comes to fuel economy and power. So upgrading the injectors, it's quite a minefield. There's a lot of different options out there, but you really want something that's tried and tested. So go to a specialist that deals with your specific engine and see what they've got in their lineup in terms of fuel injector upgrades. You're generally looking at a cc capacity, the amount of fuel that is injected. So increasing that capacity will deliver more fuel, but you obviously need to make other adjustments and just make sure that the fuel pump itself and the high pressure fuel pump are able to deliver sufficient fuel to the engine. In some cases, you may find that the high performance variants of your engine and even other models in the manufacturer's range offer better injectors. I note that some manufacturers have switched from a 4 nozzle setup to a 5 nozzle setup, and they've changed the injector type in order to maximize that spray pattern. So just dropping in injectors from the same manufacturer can often give you a little bit more headroom when it comes to tuning a car. So with engines, you've generally got port injection where the fuel is squirted into the intake itself. It goes over the valves into the engine where it mixes. And you've got direct injection where the fuel is directly injected into the cylinder, usually at the last moment. There's certainly advantages in both setups, and some of the newer engines that are coming out have both. They have port injection, which does help reduce the carbon buildup on the intake valves. A lot of people have also looked at methanol injection kits where a port injection setup is added to a direct injection setup. So that can supplement the amount of fuel going into the engine. Switching fuel types as well is another way of getting more power. For a lot of these other fuel types, you need to supply a lot more fuel to burn to make the power. So the injector capacity needs to be dramatically increased, but they generally work quite efficiently and quite cleanly. People have used various ethanol mixes. I've done videos that specifically discuss the different fuels and how people get more power out of engines just by swapping the fuel type. But for most people, for most of our viewers watching this channel, a simple fuel upgrade, changing the injector and the fuel pump is all that's necessary. And often that's only necessary when you've bumped the power up by 50 to 100 horsepower. Again, that depends very much on your engine setup. I find that the modern factory direct injection setups deliver quite a lot of fuel. They're almost over specified from the factory. So that's good. There's usually a lot more scope there for extracting power out of these before you hit a problem. But make sure there's always spare capacity. Don't calculate the fuel delivery to the exact requirements of the engine, because as those injectors degrade and get older, the fuel pump degrades and gets older, you're going to start to be running out of fuel when you need it, and the engine itself is going to have to start backing things off. So let's talk about the other common mods that people do on the Audi TT. So we've got the intake, the induction kits, the air filters and those systems. So let's just have a little chat about the air intakes on the Audi TT and what you should expect and whether they're actually worth doing. If you've done nothing else to your engine, you're wasting your money fitting an induction kit to these. The stock factory filter and intake setup flows more than adequately for the stock engine. When you start to ramp the power up significantly, you will start to hit a restriction, and that's the point you need to think about the intake. So I would still recommend going with a performance panel filter. So this replaces the factory paper filter with a higher flowing one. They're typically made of some sort of cotton gauze material, and it flows much better than the factory one. And that'll often give you a little bit more freedom at the top end. The turbo will tend to spool up that little bit more quickly because there's not so much of a restriction in the system. So the performance panel filter is really what I would recommend. If you've got experience with the full induction kits on these, please let me know. Let me know the models that you fitted or the makes of the induction kit that you fitted and what your experience has been. I'd really love to hear about your projects and what you're actually doing to this great little engine. The main reason a lot of people fit these open cone induction kit filters is because of the lovely induction roar that they create. It really does make the engine sound much more sporty, much more throaty. But the downside of that is the engine can be hard to live with on long drives and long commutes. A lot of people that have had induction kits fitted eventually tire of the noise and the constant drone. So manufacturers have designed their intakes to really minimize the noise that's coming on the intake. So you obviously lose that design feature from the manufacturer, but you are increasing the engine's ability to breathe. So depending on your engine and the other mods you do, you may well be needing to remove a restriction. So a full induction kit is obviously the best way to go. Don't sight it in the engine bay where there's all the warm air. Try and channel it off. Most engine bays, you can put some sort of box mechanism in there to just filter it and have a cold air feed, feeding cold air from outside. Because just remember that cold air has more oxygen and the engine is really needing that oxygen in order to burn the fuel. If the engine is sucking in warm air, it's getting less oxygen and it's going to be down on power. And let's now talk about the exhaust system on the Audi TT. Where are the areas that you typically find the restriction on the Audi TT exhaust? What are the best upgrades that you can do? And what can you expect from a performance exhaust system? So let's just chat about exhaust upgrades and what your options are on the Audi TT. So why are exhausts good upgrades and good mods? Well, again, it depends on the engine that you've got. The general idea is to remove restrictions in the exhaust. You want those exhaust gases to exit the engine at the fastest velocity possible. Now, the engine is pushing out these exhaust pulses. Don't think of it as a constant stream. I know when you look at the exhaust pipe itself, it seems to have a constant stream, but there's actually pulses coming out of the engine. And that's a good thing. We get a scavenging effect from this. So as each exhaust pulse pushes down the exhaust tube, there is a vacuum that forms just behind that, and that vacuum is actually beneficial to emptying the exhaust from the cylinder and just allows you to get a little bit more fresh air in. If that scavenging effect is lost, i.e. you've got an exhaust size that's too big, you're losing the velocity of the air due to the large bore size. That can have a detrimental effect on the scavenging. So effectively, you'll still have some exhaust gases in the engine on the compression stroke. So that can also lead to other problems. So there's very much a lot of consideration that goes into the design system of an exhaust. And generally, manufacturers have done a reasonable job when it comes to determining the flow rates of exhaust. But bear in mind, they've optimized it for everyday driving, usually for economy purposes. If you're a performance driver and you spend most of your time in the upper end of the RPM range, there's certainly going to be an advantage there to having a larger bore size. So ideally, for high RPMs, you want a large bore size to just maximize the flow. And at low RPM figures, you need a narrower bore size just to maintain the velocity. So as the bore size increases, the velocity generally decreases, and it really is velocity that counts. The area that most people should focus on, if it's legal to do so in your area, is the catalysts and the DPFs, the diesel particulate filters. These tend to be the biggest drag, the biggest pain in the exhaust system. There are often sports alternatives that can be fitted legally in a lot of areas, and if that's the case, that certainly is your option to freeing up that lost power due to these devices. So obviously, when you've made your car go faster, you've got a lovely quick Audi TT. You need to think about braking, brake upgrades, improving the brakes. But are they worth doing? Is it a mod that's worth considering? So let's just look at some of the options with brake upgrades. Now, often with the Audi group, you can change the brakes for more sporty models. So the Q3 RS brakes, the TT RS brakes, the Porsche, the Lamborghini brakes, they've all been used as donor upgrades for some of the less sporty models in the Audi range, and the Audi TT is no exception. So it's often a very cheap upgrade just to source parts from the local breakers yard from one of these performance models. But check the PCD, check the offset, just make sure that they will physically fit inside the rim as well. And generally speaking, they're fairly easy to swap in, and you've got an instant upgrade to your braking system. But there's a little bit of variation between model years, obviously. So seek a little bit of advice, chat to your local mechanic about the upgrade and the feasibility of what you're actually planning to just get the best out of that. So what can you expect from brake upgrades on the Audi TT? There's obviously a lot of debate out there with brakes. A lot of people have this conception that big brakes, big discs and big pads will stop the car much more quickly. But In the real world, that's not always the case when it comes to brakes. So larger brakes will generally allow the car to stop more effectively when you've done repeated stops. So on the track, you're using the brakes a lot. There's a lot more heat going into the brakes. The brakes are effectively converting the kinetic energy into heat and dissipating that. They're stopping the tyres rotating. It's the tyres and the grip you have that determines the speed at which the car stops, far more than the size of the brake disc or the pad. So there are some instances where larger brake discs and larger pads outperform the factory setup, and you do get shorter stopping distances. So most people though would just see a benefit by changing the pads, the friction material that is actually used. So just changing the pads can actually sharpen up the brakes. A lot of those budget pads are very inefficient. They don't bite very quickly, but be careful. Competition pads need to be hot in order to bite. So a competition or a race spec pad generally has a much higher operating temperature. So they will get hot very, very quickly when you apply them, but they won't bite from that instant they first go on like the factory fitted OEM ones will. So take that into account. There's various low brake dust formulations that keep the alloy rims nice and clean. And there's various different grades of friction material, but generally those budget long life ones should be avoided. They're not great options when it comes to stopping the car. I've done other videos that discuss brake upgrades in more detail, and that'll just help you to determine which brake upgrade is appropriate for your car. But it's a significant mod. A lot of people think about it. And as your brakes start to get old and start to degrade, a lot of people look to replace them with something that's a little bit better. So Quattro, the Audi four-wheel drive system, was fitted on some of the more performance-oriented versions of the Audi TT. And they're obviously the ones to go for if you want to make large power gains. On the front-wheel drive Audi TT, you will hit traction problems at about 225, 250 horsepower. And beyond that, you start to waste your money on mods if you've just got front-wheel drive. The Quattro system can be retrofitted, but it's really fiddly and really expensive to do so. Essentially, the cars are pretty much the same underneath. All the space is there to fit the Quattro system. And if you've got a Quattro donor car, that can make the transition from the front-wheel drive to the all-wheel drive system much more accessible and relatively easy to do. So let's talk about intercooler mods now. So the intercooler is basically a radiator, and it takes the compressed air from the turbo and cools it down. Why does it cool it down? Well, when you compress air, it gets very, very hot. The more the air is compressed, the hotter it gets. You've probably noticed that when you pump up your car tyre, the nozzle of the pump starts to get very warm. That's the effect of the compressed air heating up. So you really want that intake charge to be as low as possible when it comes to the intake temperature. So an intercooler effectively exposes that hot compressed air to the ambient air and drops the temperature back down. So you might think that having a massive intercooler will add loads of power, but it doesn't quite work like that. The intercooler size is generally determined by the flow rate of the engine, and you can actually reduce the velocity and the flow rate significantly by going with the wrong intercooler design. Now, a larger intercooler does offer benefits over a smaller stock factory one in that it doesn't heat up as quickly. It will dispel the heat that builds up in the exhaust charge for longer periods of time. So with a lot of factory setups, the small intercooler is barely adequate. And if you're doing a lot of spirited driving, that intercooler itself is starting to get warm. And if the radiator that the hot air is going into is warm, it's not going to be as efficient at cooling it down. So upgrading the intercooler, it doesn't significantly add power. It stops you losing power in that situation where the intercooler has started to get warm itself. So resighting the intercooler, some engines have intercoolers mounted at the side, some they have a water-cooled intercooler where the water is then channeled to the front of the car and cooled down. So just changing the routing, aiding airflow through the intercooler itself can all help to reduce those intake temperatures. A lot depends on the engine you've got and the style of the engine bay of your car and how much scope you've got of maybe adding a larger intercooler at the front. But generally speaking, the front mount intercoolers perform really well. They're relatively cost effective. The downside is the long runs that you have in pipes to feed them. So that's why a lot of manufacturers have a water mounted intercooler mounted quite close to the engine. It's easier to pump the water around than it is to get the air charge moving around the engine bay. And they then expose that water to the ambient air temperature, which reduces the temperature of the water, which is then passed on to that intake charge as it goes into the engine. But we're talking about fairly complex setups there. So intercooler upgrades are usually quite expensive and they don't add significant amounts of power, but it can help to free up power on those higher powered projects. So let's talk about the flywheel now. So the flywheel itself, what's it do? Well, it's a large metal disc, a weight on the side of the engine. And as the engine spins, the flywheel spins. So an engine is never perfect. There's a series of explosions going on at staged intervals. There's a lot of vibration going on in the engine. The components are moving up and down, left and right. There's an awful lot going on inside the engine, and you don't really want that to upset the smooth running of the engine. So the flywheel effectively stores the kinetic energy and just smooths everything out. So in the gaps where nothing is happening explosion wise in the engine, the flywheel is still rotating the engine assembly, the transmission assembly. So it keeps everything moving smoothly. So the heavier the flywheel is, the less inclined the engine will be to lose RPMs when you drop off the throttle. If the flywheel itself is lighter, the engine revs, the RPM will drop quite suddenly as soon as you ease off. So that can be beneficial in a race situation where, for example, you want to do some rev matching. You want those rev changes to happen very quickly to have maximum control over the engine. But on the long run, you really want the flywheel to maintain momentum. Otherwise, as soon as you hit a hill, you're going to have to make a conscious adjustment on the accelerator for every little fluctuation that you get, whereas the flywheel helps to keep everything smooth. So with some engines, they have a dual mass flywheel, which is essentially two sprung-loaded plates or weights, and they work to really dramatically minimize the amount of vibration going through the transmission from the engine. So a lot of dual mass flywheels start to suffer. They start to break down. The springs, there's a lot of vibration going on in them. They are taking a lot of abuse. But it's better to have that abuse in something that's relatively cheap to replace than in your expensive transmission or other components within the engine. So when people replace the clutch, they generally look to replace the flywheel. If you've got a dual mass flywheel, it is possible to replace it with a single mass flywheel, but on some engines, particularly older diesel engines, that's not always advisable. You really do want that protection from all the vibrations that are going on in the engine. But do ask people who've done this mod, specifically if they've got the same engine as you, and just compare notes. Is it giving you the advantages or the flexibility that you want? Another little plus of having a lighter flywheel is there's less weight in the car. And less weight allows the car to accelerate more quickly. It makes it handle better. So most people for an everyday car would just look to get a slightly lighter flywheel. You can get slightly lighter dual mass flywheels and slightly lighter single mass flywheels for most engines. So I hope that's given you a good overview on all the mods that you can do to the Audi TT. Please check out the engine guides that I've done. I go into a lot more detail on the engines. There's so many differences between the engines, particularly the gasoline engines, the turbocharged, the naturally aspirated, and also the diesel engines. They have a very, very different approach to tuning and upgrade parts, and different years had different challenges to face as well. There were different problems associated with different generations of the engines. So I've tried to do videos just to make you aware of these problems and avoid those usual pitfalls that people hit when they start modifying and upgrading their Audi TT. So please boot the like button, because that really does help us to get out there. If you're interested in learning more about getting performance out of your car, I've lined this video up for you, and please subscribe if you haven't done so, because we'd love you to stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in this next video.